If you ever walk into a house for the first time and everyone already knows your name, run. That was the thought that hit me too late, because by the time I realized something was wrong, I was already standing on the front porch of Lucas's childhood home, fingers laced with his, heart beating just a little too fast for what was supposed to be a normal meet-the-parents night. Except nothing about Lucas had ever been completely normal. Not the way he avoided talking about his family. Not the way he gently changed the subject whenever I asked where he grew up. Not the way he stiffened. Now beside me as the door slowly opened and warm yellow light spilled across the driveway, catching the edge of his jaw, making him look like someone bracing for impact rather than someone coming home. And I almost joked about it. Something light, something to break the tension. But the words died somewhere in my throat when his mom stepped into view and just stared at me. Not surprised, not curious. Just frozen like she'd been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. And then her lips parted into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she said softly, almost breathlessly, "Daniel, you're finally home." And everything inside me went still, like someone had pressed pause on my body while my brain scrambled to catch up, because that wasn't my name. It wasn't even close, and I let out this awkward little laugh, expecting Lucas to jump in, to correct her, to say something like, "Mom, this is Ethan." But he didn't. His hand just tightened around mine, fingers locking like a warning. And when I glanced at him, his expression was unreadable, calm on the surface, but with something tight underneath, something I couldn't name but definitely felt. And that's when his dad appeared behind her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder before looking at me with a kind of quiet recognition that made my chest feel too small. "We've been waiting for you," he said, like I'd been gone, like I'd belonged here once. And suddenly the night air felt colder, sharper, cutting through my jacket as I stepped inside, because turning around felt impossible now, like the moment had already decided for me. And the house smelled like cedar and something faintly sweet, familiar in a way that made no sense. And my shoes tapped against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that felt known, like I'd walked this path before even though I knew I hadn't, I couldn't have. And yet my eyes drifted down the hallway without thinking, drawn to it, like something was pulling me forward from somewhere deep and quiet in my chest. And Lucas's voice came low beside me, almost too soft. "Ethan," like he was trying to anchor me, but I barely heard him because his mom was already talking again. Already moving as if nothing strange had happened, as if calling me by another name was the most natural thing in the world. "Dinner's almost ready, Daniel," she said, and this time no one corrected her, not Lucas, not his dad, not even me, because my voice wouldn't come out. And when I finally forced myself to look at Lucas, really look at him, there was something in his eyes I had never seen before, something close to fear, or maybe guilt, and it settled into my stomach like a weight, heavy and sinking. And for the first time since I met him, I had a thought I couldn't shake, quiet but sharp, pressing against everything I thought I knew about us. What if I wasn't the first person to stand here holding his hand? And what if everyone in this house already knew that except me? The dining room felt too warm, like the air had been sitting still for hours waiting for something to happen, and I could feel it, pressing against my skin as Lucas guided me to a chair at the table, his hand lingering at the small of my back for just a second longer than necessary. Not comforting, not casual, more like he was steadying something fragile that only he could feel. And I sat down slowly, aware of every movement, every glance, every breath, because they were all watching me, not openly, not rudely, but in that quiet, careful way people look at something they do not want to scare away. And it made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, like I had stepped into a role I did not remember auditioning for. And across from me his mom placed a plate down with a soft clink, her fingers brushing the edge just slightly before she pulled back, eyes flickering up to meet mine with something that looked dangerously close to relief. "I made your favorite," she said gently, and my stomach dropped again because I had never eaten here, never told her anything about what I liked, never even met her until 5 minutes ago. And yet the food in front of me was exactly what I would have ordered without thinking, like someone had memorized my preferences before I even knew them myself. And I let out a small laugh that sounded wrong in my own ears. "That is a lucky guess," I said, trying to keep it light, trying to pull the moment back into something normal, something safe. But no one laughed, no one corrected her, and Lucas's fork hovered in midair for a second before he forced himself to take a bite like everything was fine, like this was just another dinner, except his jaw was tight, and I could see the tension in the way his shoulders held just a little too still, and it made something twist uncomfortably inside me, a quiet question that refused to stay quiet. And I leaned slightly toward him, lowering my voice just enough that it should have been private. "Lucas," I whispered. "Why do they keep calling me that?" But he did not answer right away. His eyes stayed on his plate like the pattern in the ceramic was suddenly fascinating. And for a second I thought he might pretend he did not hear me. But then he exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried weight, and murmured, "Not here." So softly I almost missed it. And something about those two words made my pulse jump, because it was not confusion, it was not surprise, it was confirmation. And before I could press further, his dad cleared his throat from the end of the table, drawing my attention back. "You used to sit there every night," he said casually, gesturing to my chair like he was pointing out something obvious, something ordinary, and the words hit me harder than they should have, because I had no memory of this place, no memory of these people, no memory of anything that connected me to this house. And yet the longer I sat there, the more everything felt aligned, like pieces sliding into place just out of sight. And when I reached for my glass without looking, my hand found it exactly where I expected it to be, like I had done it 100 times before. And that was the moment my breath caught, sharp and sudden, because that was not a coincidence. That was something else entirely, something deeper, something I could not explain. And I set the glass down slowly, my fingers suddenly unsteady as a quiet thought pressed its way forward, louder now, harder. To ignore. What if this was not their mistake? What if this was mine? And I swallowed, forcing myself to look at Lucas again, really look at him, searching for anything that made sense, any crack in the calm mask he was wearing. But all I found was that same tight expression, that same controlled stillness, and underneath it something that looked like he was waiting for me to remember something I did not know I had forgotten. And it made my skin prickle as the room seemed to close in just slightly, the walls inching closer, the voices softer, the air heavier, until the only thing I could hear clearly was my own heartbeat and the quiet, persistent echo of that name repeating in my mind. Not foreign anymore, not entirely wrong, just unfamiliar in a way that felt dangerously close to recognition. And I did not know which possibility scared me more, that they were all mistaken, or that they were not. Lucas did not let go of my hand when I stood up from the table, and that alone should have comforted me. Except it did not, because his grip felt less like affection and more like urgency, like he was trying to keep me from drifting too far into something neither of us could control. And I followed him down the hallway without saying a word, my footsteps quieter now, more careful, like the house might react if I moved too loudly. And the strange part was not the silence. It was how familiar that silence felt, like I already knew where the floor would creak and where it would not. Like my body had memorized this place long before my mind ever caught up. And when Lucas finally stopped in front of a closed door, his hand tightened once before he let go, fingers lingering for just a second in the empty space between us, and I could feel it, that hesitation, that moment where he almost said something but chose not to, and it made my chest tighten, because whatever he was about to show me, he was not ready for it either. And he pushed the door open slowly, like he was revealing something fragile instead of something ordinary, and the room inside was untouched, not just clean, not just organized, but preserved, like time had stopped here while the rest of the house kept moving. And I stepped inside without thinking, drawn forward by something I could not explain, and my eyes moved over the desk, the neatly stacked books, the bed with its corners tucked just right, and then the photos, and my breath caught so sharply it almost hurt. Because there he was again, that same face, that same smile, standing beside Lucas in picture after picture, not just similar, not just close, but identical, down to the way his hair fell across his forehead, down to the way his shoulders angled slightly when he laughed, and my fingers curled at my sides as I took another step closer, like I needed to prove to myself that I was seeing this wrong, that there was some detail I had missed, some difference I could point to and say this is not me. But there was nothing, not a single thing, and behind me Lucas exhaled slowly, the sound heavy, weighted, like it had been sitting in his chest for a long time. And I did not turn around. I could not, because my eyes had already moved to the mirror on the far wall. And for a moment, everything seemed to narrow into that one reflection, the room behind me, the photos beside me, Lucas standing somewhere just out of frame, and me, standing there looking exactly like the person in those pictures. And my voice came out quieter than I expected, almost unsteady. Lucas, who is he? Even though I already knew the answer, even though I could feel it pressing against the edges of my thoughts, and he did not answer right away. And that silence said more than anything else could have, stretching just long enough to make my pulse spike. And then he said it, low and careful, like each word mattered. His name was Daniel. Was. Not is. And something inside me shifted at that, something small but significant, like a piece sliding out of place. And I finally turned to look at him, searching his face for anything that made sense, any hint that this was a coincidence, that this was just some strange overlap of features and timing. But all I found was that same expression from before, that same controlled tension, and underneath it something else, something softer and far more dangerous, recognition, and my throat tightened as the question formed before I could stop it. Why do I look exactly like him? And Lucas's gaze flickered, just for a second, not away from me, but deeper into me, like he was searching for something beyond what was visible. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped even lower, almost like a confession he was not ready to make. That is not the part you should be asking. And a chill ran through me despite the warmth of the room, because the way he said it did not sound like a deflection, it sounded like a warning, and my heart started to pound harder, louder, filling the silence between us as that same thought from earlier returned, sharper now, more insistent, pressing against everything I thought I knew about myself. And for the first time I did not try to push it away. I let it surface, let it take shape, because if he was not surprised, if his family was not mistaken, if this house felt like something I had forgotten instead of something I had never known, then there was only one possibility left, one that made my breath hitch as I stared at my own reflection, trying to see past the face I recognized into something I did not. And the words formed in my mind before I could stop them, quiet but undeniable. What if I have been here before the silence between us stretched until it felt like something physical, like a thread pulled too tight that could snap at any second? And I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to, my chest barely rising as I stared at Lucas, waiting for him to say something that would make this make sense, something simple, something normal. But he just stood there, watching me like he was measuring every reaction, every flicker of confusion, every shift in my expression, and it made my skin prickle because it did not feel like he was seeing me, not fully. It felt like he was comparing me to something else, something he already knew. And that thought landed heavy in my stomach as I turned back toward the desk, needing something solid, something real, anything that could anchor me in the present. And my fingers brushed the surface lightly before I could stop myself, tracing the edge like I had done it before, like my body recognized the motion even if my mind refused to. And that was the part that scared me the most, not the photos, not the name, but the way everything here felt like a memory just out of reach, like a word on the tip of my tongue that I could almost say, but not quite. And I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady even as my thoughts spiraled. You said his name was Daniel, I said slowly, each word deliberate, like I was building something fragile that could collapse if I moved too fast. What happened to him? And the moment the question left my mouth, Lucas's expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else might notice. But I saw it, that brief tightening around his eyes, that flicker of something deeper than hesitation, and he looked away for the first time since we stepped into the room, his gaze dropping to the floor like it held something easier to face than me. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the control he had been holding on to all night. He was here, he said, and that was not an answer, not really. But the way he said it made something in my chest ache, like the absence of the rest of the sentence was louder than anything he could have added. And I shook my head slightly, stepping closer without realizing it, drawn in by the gravity of whatever he was not saying. That is not what I asked. I pressed, softer now, but more certain, because I needed the truth. I needed something that did not feel like a half step away from reality. And Lucas finally looked back at me, really looked at me, and there was no avoiding it this time. No shifting away, no deflecting, just that same weight in his eyes, heavier now, closer to something that looked like regret. and he took a slow breath before answering. He left, and the words landed wrong, not because they were unclear, but because they felt incomplete, like there was more behind them that he was choosing not to say, and my mind caught on that instantly, turning it over, examining it, because left could mean anything. It could mean he walked away. It could mean he disappeared. It could mean something far more complicated than either of those, and I felt my pulse quicken as the question formed again, sharper this time, more urgent. "And you never saw him again?" I said, not quite a question, more like something I was trying to confirm, and Lucas hesitated just long enough for my stomach to twist before he answered, "Not the way you think." And that was when something shifted, not in him, not in the room, but in me, because the way he said it, the way his voice softened just slightly on the word you, it felt like he was not talking about Daniel anymore. It felt like he was talking about me, and the realization hit quietly but hard, settling into my chest with a weight I could not ignore, and I took a step back without meaning to, the distance between us suddenly necessary, like I needed space to breathe, to think, to separate myself from whatever this was, and my gaze flickered back to the mirror again, to that reflection that looked exactly like the person in the photos, and for a split second something flashed. Behind my eyes, not a full memory, not even a clear image, just a fragment, a feeling, standing in this same room, in this same spot, with a voice calling my name, not Ethan, something else, something that slipped away the moment I tried to hold on to it. And I inhaled sharply, my hand coming up to press against my temple, as if that could steady the sudden rush of something I could not fully grasp, and Lucas moved then, just one step closer, his voice careful, almost cautious. "Ethan," he said, like he was testing the name, like he needed to make sure it still fit, and I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for any sign that I was imagining this, that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. But the truth was already there, sitting in the space between us, heavy and unavoidable, and I felt it settle in my chest as the question finally took shape. No longer something I could ignore, no longer something I could push aside, and when I spoke, my voice was quieter than before, but steadier, because I needed the answer, no matter what it was. "Lucas," I said, "when you look at me, are you seeing him or are you seeing me?" And the silence that followed was answer enough. Lucas did not answer right away, and that silence pressed harder than anything he could have said, stretching between us until it felt like the room itself was waiting, like the walls were listening, and I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flickered just slightly before settling back on me, like he was choosing every second not to look away, not this time. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of that careful control he had been holding onto all night. "I am looking at you," he said, but there was something beneath it, something unsteady that did not match the certainty of the words, and I felt it immediately, like a crack running under the surface, because if it were that simple, if it were that true, none of this would feel the way it did, none of this would be happening. And I shook my head slowly, taking another step back as if distance might help me think, might help me separate myself from whatever this was, but it did not, because everything in this room kept pulling me closer, the photos, the furniture, the quiet familiarity that wrapped around me like something I had forgotten how to take off, and my gaze drifted to the desk again, to the small stack of items I had not looked at yet. And before I could stop myself, I reached for the top drawer, my fingers curling around the handle with a certainty that did not feel like guesswork, like I already knew what I would find, and that realization alone made my pulse spike, because I should not know anything about this room, not where things were, not how they felt, not how easily my hand moved as I pulled the drawer open, and inside was a collection of small, ordinary things, nothing dramatic, nothing that should have mattered, but they did, because each one felt like it belonged to me in a way I could not explain. A watch with a worn leather strap, a pen with teeth marks along the side, a folded piece of paper tucked carefully beneath them, and my breath caught as I reached for it, my fingers hesitating just slightly before unfolding it, like some part of me already knew what it might say, and the paper was aged, not old enough to be forgotten, but not new either, creased along the same lines it had been folded over and over again. And the handwriting was neat but familiar in a way that made my chest tighten, because as my eyes moved across the words, something in me recognized the way the letters curved, The way certain strokes pressed harder than others, like I had seen it before, like I had written it before, and I swallowed. My throat suddenly dry as I read the first line. If you are reading this, then something went wrong. And the words blurred for a second as my grip on the paper tightened, my heart pounding louder now, drowning out everything else, the room, the silence, even Lucas standing just behind me. And I forced myself to keep reading, each word landing heavier than the last. You might not remember this place, or me, or even yourself the way you should, but you need to trust one thing. And my breath hitched, because the voice in my head reading those words did not feel separate. It did not feel like someone else. It felt like mine, steady and certain in a way I was not. And I could feel Lucas move behind me, just one step closer, like he already knew what I was holding, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. And I continued, my voice barely above a whisper as I read aloud without meaning to. Your name is Daniel. And the world seemed to tilt just slightly, the floor not quite where it should be, the air shifting in a way that made it harder to breathe, and I lowered the paper slowly, my hands unsteady now as I stared at the words like they might change if I looked long enough, like they might rearrange into something that made more sense. But they did not. They stayed exactly the same, clear and undeniable, and I could feel Lucas's presence behind me, close enough now that I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, steady but heavier than before, and I turned just enough to look at him, my voice quieter than it had ever been, but sharper, because I needed the truth now, more than anything else. You knew, I said, not a question, not really, because the answer was already there in the way he closed his eyes. For just a second, like he had been holding this back for too long, and when he opened them again, there was no hesitation left, no careful distance, just something raw and unavoidable, and he said it, simply, like it had always been there waiting. I have been waiting for you to remember. The words settled into the space between us like something irreversible, like a door that had already closed behind me without me noticing. And for a moment I could not move, could not think, could not even decide if I should be angry or afraid, because waiting for you to remember was not something you said to someone you loved. It was something you said to someone you had lost, and I felt that distinction hit somewhere deep, somewhere I could not easily ignore, and my grip on the paper tightened until the edges pressed sharply into my fingers, grounding me just enough to keep from spiraling. Remember what? I asked, my voice quieter now, but edged with something sharper, something that demanded an answer instead of avoiding it. And Lucas did not hesitate this time, not the way he had before, his gaze steady on mine like he had already decided there was no point in hiding anything anymore. Everything, he said, and the simplicity of it made it worse, because everything was too much, too vague, too heavy to even begin to understand, and I let out a breath that did not feel like relief, more like something unraveling as I shook my head slowly, stepping away from him again, needing space, needing distance, because the closer he stood, the harder it was to separate his words from the way they felt. That does not make sense, I said, even though part of me already knew it did, or at least, that it would, eventually, and that thought alone made my chest tighten, and I turned back toward the desk, toward the drawer, toward the pieces of a life that were not supposed to be mine, and yet felt like they were waiting for me to claim them. And I picked up the watch this time, the leather worn soft under my fingers like it had been used for years, and without thinking I flipped it over, my thumb brushing across the back where a faint engraving caught the light, and my breath stilled as I read it. D.B. Simple, small, but unmistakable, and something about it made my chest ache in a way that felt too familiar, like a memory pressing against the edges of my mind, trying to surface, and I squeezed my eyes shut for just a second, willing it to come through, to make sense, but all I got was a flash, brief and disjointed, standing outside in the rain, the same watch in my hand, Lucas in front of me saying something I could not quite hear, and then nothing, just emptiness where the rest should have been, and I inhaled sharply, my eyes snapping open as the room rushed back into focus, and Lucas was closer now, not touching me, not yet, but near enough that I could feel the warmth of him, steady and real in contrast to everything else that felt like it was slipping. You wrote that note, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the haze in my head, and I looked at him, my brow furrowing because that was impossible. It had to be. No, I said immediately, but the word lacked conviction, even to my own ears, because the handwriting, the phrasing, the certainty in those lines, it all felt too close, too aligned with something I could not name. And Lucas did not argue, did not push. He just watched me with that same steady expression, like he was waiting for me to catch up to something he had already accepted. You left it for yourself, he added, softer now, and that made my pulse jump again, because that meant there had been a version of me who knew this might happen, who planned for it, who anticipated forgetting everything and tried to leave a trail back. And that realization settled heavy in my chest, because it meant this was not random, not accidental. This was something that had already happened once before, and I felt my hand tighten around the watch, grounding myself in its weight as I whispered, more to myself than to him. Why would I need to remember something I chose to forget? And Lucas's expression shifted just slightly, not surprise, not confusion, but something quieter, something that looked almost like sadness. And he took a slow breath before answering, his voice steady but softer than before. Because you did not choose it, he said, and the words landed with a weight that made everything else fall silent. Because if I had not chosen it, then something else had, something outside of me, something that had taken whatever this was and buried it deep enough that even standing here, surrounded by it, I still could not fully reach it. And the thought sent a chill through me as I looked back at the mirror again, at the face staring back that was supposed to be mine, and for the first time it did not feel entirely familiar, like I was looking at something I recognized but did not completely understand. And I could feel it now, clearer than before, not a full memory, not even a full thought, just a presence, something sitting just beneath the surface of everything I thought I was. Waiting, and the question came back again, stronger this time, harder to ignore, not just who am I, but what if the answer has been here all along, just out of reach, waiting for me to finally look in the right direction. The air in the room felt different now, heavier, like something had shifted just enough that there was no going back to what this was supposed to be, and I could feel it settling into my chest, that quiet, creeping realization that whatever truth Lucas had been holding on to, I was already standing in the middle of it, whether I understood it or not. And my fingers tightened around the watch as I tried to steady myself, to hold on to something real, something solid. But even that felt uncertain now, like it belonged to a version of me I had not met yet. And I exhaled slowly, forcing my voice to stay level even as my thoughts began to spiral again. Then what happened? I asked, not looking at him this time, my eyes fixed on the reflection in the mirror, because it was easier to ask the question without seeing his reaction, easier to pretend this was just a conversation instead of something unraveling. And Lucas did not answer right away, but this time the silence felt different, not avoidance, not hesitation, but wait, like he was deciding how much I was ready to hear. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped down to something honest and unguarded. You disappeared, he said, and the words landed softly but carried something sharp underneath, something that cut deeper the longer I let them sit. And I frowned slightly, my grip tightening again as I turned that over in my mind, because disappeared did not feel like something that just happened. It felt intentional, deliberate, like a choice or a consequence. And I shook my head, my reflection doing the same a second later, like it was catching up instead of moving with me. And that tiny delay sent a chill down my spine, because for just a second it did not feel like I was entirely in sync with myself. And I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus, to stay grounded. People do not just disappear, I said, more firmly now, like I could anchor the situation with logic alone. But Lucas only watched me, that same steady gaze that made it impossible to tell where his thoughts ended and mine began. And he stepped a little closer, not enough to touch, but enough that I could feel the shift in the space between us, like something narrowing, something inevitable. You told me you needed time, he said slowly, each word measured, deliberate, like he had replayed this moment in his head more than once. You said you had to figure something out, and then you were just gone. And there was something in his voice on that last word, something quiet and restrained that made my chest tighten, because it did not sound like anger, it sounded like loss, and that was worse. And I felt my breath catch as another fragment flickered at the edge of my mind. Not clear, not complete, but enough to make my pulse jump, standing outside again. The same feeling of urgency, of something unfinished, Lucas reaching for me, saying something I could not quite hear, and me stepping back instead of forward, and I inhaled sharply, the image slipping away before I could hold on to it, leaving only the echo of it behind, and I pressed my fingers briefly against my temple again, trying to steady the sudden rush of something I could not fully grasp, and Lucas noticed, of course he did, his gaze sharpening slightly as he watched me, like he was tracking every change, every reaction, every hint that something was starting to surface. "You are remembering," he said quietly, not a question, but not quite a statement either. More like an observation he was not sure he should trust yet, and I shook my head instinctively, even though part of me knew he was right, even though something inside me was shifting, moving, trying to break through the surface. "No," I said, but my voice wavered just enough to betray me. And Lucas did not push, did not argue, he just stayed there, close enough to feel, distant enough not to overwhelm, like he understood this had to come from me, not from anything he said. And I lowered my hand slowly, my gaze returning to the mirror, to that reflection that felt just slightly off now, like I was looking at a version of myself that had lived a life I could not remember. And the question came back again, stronger now, heavier. Not just who am I, but what if I was not just forgetting something? What if I had been someone else entirely? And the thought settled into my chest with a weight that made it harder to breathe. Because if that was true, if I had been here before, if I had lived something with Lucas that I could not recall, then the person standing here now, the one calling himself Ethan, might not be the whole story, and I felt that realization sink in as I whispered, barely audible even to myself. "Why can I not remember leaving?" And Lucas's expression shifted again, softer this time, almost careful, like he was about to step onto something fragile, and when he answered, his voice was quiet but certain. "Because you did not leave the way you think you did." And the way he said it made everything inside me go still, because that was not just an answer, it was a warning, and I could feel it now, clearer than ever, that whatever happened here, whatever I had forgotten, it was not something simple, not something I could brush off or explain away. It was something that had changed everything. And somehow, I had been at the center of it. The words did not just linger, they echoed, repeating in the quiet space of my mind like something that refused to settle. Because, "not the way you think you did," was not just confusing. It was unsettling in a way that made everything else feel unstable, like I was standing on something that looked solid but was already shifting beneath me. And I felt it in the way my chest tightened, the way my breath came slower, more deliberate, like I had to remind myself how to take it in. And I turned slightly, my gaze drifting back to the desk, to the open drawer, to the note still resting in my hand, like it was waiting for me to understand something I had not yet caught up to. And I read the first line again silently, letting the words settle deeper this time. "If you are reading this, then something went wrong." And that was the part that hit differently now, because wrong meant this was not supposed to happen, or at least not like this. And I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly on the paper as I spoke again, quieter now, more focused. "What went wrong?" And Lucas exhaled slowly behind me, the sound controlled but heavier than before, like he had been expecting that question but still was not sure how to answer it. And when he did, his voice was careful, measured in a way that felt deliberate. "You said you were starting to forget things," he said, and the words landed softly but carried weight, and I froze for a second, my grip on the note tightening as I turned that over. Because forgetting things was different from everything else he had said so far. It was not sudden, it was not clean, it was gradual, something that crept in slowly, quietly, until it became impossible to ignore, and that thought alone made something cold settle in my chest. Because if that was true, then this had not happened all at once. It had been building, piece by piece, moment by moment, until whatever I had been became whatever I was now. And I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against it. "That does not make sense," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt weaker than before, less certain, because the evidence was all around me, in the room, in the photos, in the way my body reacted before my mind could catch up. And Lucas stepped closer again, just enough that I could feel the shift in the air between us, his presence. Steady, grounding in a way that made everything else feel sharper by contrast. "You thought it was stress at first," he continued, his voice quieter now, like he was walking me through something fragile. You kept forgetting small things, where you put your keys, what you said a few minutes ago, things that did not seem important. And as he spoke, something in me tightened, because those details felt too familiar, not as memories, not yet, but as patterns, as something my body recognized even if my mind did not. And I could feel it now, that faint unease, like something just out of reach that I had almost noticed before, and I pressed my fingers lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding myself again. And then, I said, my voice lower now, because I already knew there was more. There had to be, and Lucas did not hesitate this time. Then you forgot me, he said, and everything in me went still, because that was not just a statement. It was something heavier, something that carried more weight than anything else he had said, and I felt it settle into my chest like a stone, heavy and immovable, because forgetting him meant this was not just about misplaced keys or missed details. It meant losing something fundamental, something that defined who I had been, and I swallowed hard, my throat tightening as I looked at him, really looked at him, searching for anything that made this feel less real, less final. But all I found was that same steady gaze, that same quiet certainty, and underneath it something softer, something that looked like he had already lived through this once before. And that realization made my pulse spike, because it meant this was not new to him. It meant he had watched this happen, step by step, moment by moment, and there had been nothing he could do to stop it. And I felt my hand tremble slightly as I lowered the note, my eyes flickering back to the mirror again, to that reflection that felt just slightly out of sync, like I was looking at something that had been reshaped without my knowledge. And the question came back again, louder now, more urgent. Not just who am I, but what did I lose to become this version of myself? And I could feel it, pressing in on me now, that sense of something missing, not just memories, but something deeper, something that had been part of me and was no longer there. And I whispered, almost without meaning to, how much did I forget? And Lucas's expression shifted again, softer this time, almost careful, like he was about to say something that would change everything. And when he answered, his voice was quiet but certain, enough that you had to start over. And the words landed heavily, because starting over did not just mean forgetting. It meant becoming someone else entirely. And as I stood there, holding a note written by a version of myself I could not remember, in a room that felt like it belonged to someone I might have been, I realized with a clarity that made my chest tighten that this was not just about finding what I had lost. It was about facing the possibility that the person I had been might not exist anymore. And the only question left was whether I was ready to find out who I had become. Instead, the words "start over" did not fade. They settled, heavy and permanent, like something that had already reshaped everything before I even realized it was happening. And I could feel it now, that quiet fracture between who I thought I was and who I might have been, stretching wider with every second I stood in that room. And I lowered myself slowly onto the edge of the bed without meaning to, the mattress dipping beneath my weight in a way that felt disturbingly familiar, like my body knew exactly how it would feel before I even touched it. And that realization alone made my chest tighten, because it was not just memories I was missing. It was something deeper, something physical, something ingrained. And I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling shakily as I tried to piece together something that made sense. So I forgot you, I said finally, my voice quieter now, not as sharp as before, more hollow, like I was testing the shape of the words rather than rejecting them. And Lucas did not move, did not interrupt. He just stood there, watching me with that same steady expression, like he had already walked through this moment in his mind 100 times and knew there was nothing he could say to make it easier. And I swallowed hard, my gaze drifting back to the note in my hand, to the handwriting that felt too close, too familiar to ignore, and I unfolded it fully this time, my eyes scanning the rest of the words, searching for something I had missed, something that could anchor all of this into something real. And the next line made my breath catch again. Do not trust your memory. It will betray you. And I let out a quiet, disbelieving breath, because that was not just a warning. It was a confirmation, and I could feel it now, the way my thoughts felt uneven, like pieces that did not quite fit together, like something had been rearranged without my knowledge. And I shook my head slowly, pressing the heel of my hand briefly against my forehead, as if that might steady the sudden rush of everything colliding at once. Why would I write that? I muttered, more to myself than to him, because it did not make sense, None of it did. And Lucas finally moved then, just one step closer, careful, deliberate, like he was approaching something fragile. Because you were scared, he said quietly, and I looked up at him, my brow furrowing, because that was the first time he had given me something that felt like an emotion instead of a fact, and it landed differently, softer but somehow heavier, and I held his gaze for a second, searching for anything that might explain it, anything that might make this feel less like something I was discovering and more like something I could understand. Of what? I asked, and Lucas hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it, that flicker of something deeper, something he had not said yet, and when he answered, his voice dropped slightly, like the words themselves carried weight, of losing yourself completely. And the room seemed to go quieter after that, like even the air had stilled to listen, and I felt it settle into me. That phrase, losing yourself completely, because that was not just forgetting things, that was not just missing pieces, that was something more final, something that suggested there had been a point where I was still me, still whole, and I had known I was slipping away, and I had tried to stop it, or at least prepare for it. And that realization hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant there had been a version of me who saw this coming, who understood what was happening and still could not prevent it. And I felt my grip on the note tighten again as my eyes moved further down the page, scanning quickly now, urgently, until another line caught my attention, shorter this time, written with more pressure, like it had been added later, like it mattered more. If you meet him again, do not let him make you remember too quickly. And my breath caught, sharp and sudden, because that was not just a warning about memory. That was about Lucas, about him, about this exact moment. And I looked up slowly, my eyes locking onto his, my heart pounding louder now as the implications settled in. Because if I had written that, if I had known I would meet him again, then this was not chance, this was not coincidence, this was something that had been set in motion long before I understood it. And I could see it in Lucas's expression now, that same quiet tension, that same careful distance, like he was holding something back even now, even after everything he had said. And I felt the question rise again, sharper this time, more focused, cutting through the confusion with something almost clear. What did I ask you to do? I said slowly, because if I had left myself a warning about him, then there had to be something else, something I had told him, something he had been following this whole time. And Lucas held my gaze for a long moment, silent, unmoving, and then he exhaled softly, the sound almost lost in the quiet room, before answering, his voice steady but lower than before. You told me not to tell you everything. And the words settled heavily between us, because that meant this, everything happening right now, every piece of truth he had given me, was only part of it, and the rest, whatever it was still waiting, just out of reach, exactly where I had left it. The words did not just sit between us, they shifted something, like a boundary I did not know existed had just been crossed, and I could feel it in the way my thoughts started moving differently, sharper now, more focused, like I was no longer just reacting to what Lucas was telling me, but starting to question why. And that realization alone made my chest tighten, because if I had told him not to tell me everything, then there had to be a reason, a specific reason, something I had understood before that I was not ready to face yet. And I exhaled slowly, my fingers still curled around the note as I looked down at it again, scanning the words like they might rearrange themselves into something clearer if I just stared long enough. But they did not. They stayed exactly the same, quiet and deliberate, like a message left by someone who knew I would not understand it right away. And I swallowed, my voice lower now, steadier in a way that surprised even me. Why would I do that? I asked, not looking at him this time, because I already knew he would not answer directly. Not yet. Not if he was following whatever rules I had set for him. And Lucas did not respond immediately, but the silence this time felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but intentional, like he was choosing it, like he was holding the line I had drawn for him even now. And that realization settled heavily in my chest, because it meant he was not just withholding the truth, he was respecting something I had asked for, even if it meant watching me struggle through it. And I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head slightly as I pressed the note flat against my palm, grounding myself in its texture, its weight, its presence, because everything else felt too fluid, too unstable. You said I was scared. I continued, piecing it together slowly, carefully, like I was building something fragile that could collapse if I rushed it, scared of losing myself. And Lucas's gaze softened just slightly, not enough to change his expression completely, but enough that I noticed, enough that I felt it. And he nodded once, a small, controlled movement that carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could. And I felt something shift again, something subtle but significant, because that meant I had not just been afraid. I had been aware enough to recognize what was happening, aware enough to try to control it. And that thought settled deeper than anything else so far, because it meant this was not something that had happened to me without warning. It was something I had seen coming, something I had prepared for, and I could feel it now, that faint echo of urgency, of something unfinished, pressing at the edges of my mind. And I closed my eyes for just a second, letting it surface, letting it take shape. And for a moment, there was something there, a fragment, a feeling, standing in this same room, holding this same note, writing it with a hand that did not hesitate, with a certainty I did not feel now. And the thought hit me suddenly, sharp and clear. What if I trusted him too much? And my eyes opened immediately, my breath catching as I looked up at Lucas again, the question forming before I could stop it. Did I think you would tell me everything? I asked, because that was the only reason I could think of to leave a warning like that. And Lucas's expression shifted just slightly. Not surprise, not denial, but something quieter, something that looked like understanding. And he held my gaze for a long moment before answering, his voice low and steady. You thought I would try, he said, and the words landed differently than I expected, because they were not defensive, not dismissive. They were honest in a way that made my chest tighten, and I felt it then. That subtle shift in perspective, because if I had expected him to tell me everything, then I must have known he would not be able to hold back. Not completely, not when it came to me. And that realization settled heavily in my chest, because it meant this was not just about memory. It was about trust, about how much of the truth I was ready to face at once. And I looked down at the note again, at the line that warned me not to let him make me remember too quickly. And I could feel it now, that tension between what I wanted to know and what I might not be ready to understand. And I swallowed, my voice quieter now, more deliberate. Then you are not telling me everything now, I said. And it was not an accusation, not really, more like a realization, something I was finally starting to accept. And Lucas did not deny it, did not argue. He just nodded once, the movement small but certain, and I felt that settle into me, not as frustration, not as anger, but as something else entirely, something heavier, something that suggested this was not just a mystery to solve. It was something to move through, step by step, piece by piece. And I exhaled slowly, my grip on the note loosening just slightly as I looked back at him, really looked at him, trying to see him. Not as the person I thought I knew, but as the one who had been here before, who had seen this happen already, who had been waiting for me to catch up. And the question came back again, quieter this time, but more focused, more precise. What happens if I remember everything too fast? I asked, and Lucas's expression stilled completely, the answer already there before he even spoke. And when he did, his voice was soft but certain, like he had been holding this one back the longest. Last time, it broke you. And the words settled into the room like something final, something that could not be taken back. And I felt them land deep, deeper than anything else he had said, because this was not just about forgetting anymore. It was about what happened when I remembered. And for the first time since I stepped into this house, I was not just afraid of what I had lost. I was afraid of what I might find if I tried to get it back. The words did not just land. They settled deep, like something that had already happened and could not be undone. And for a moment, everything in the room felt too still, too quiet, like even the air was waiting for me to react. But I did not move. I could not, because it broke you echoed in my mind in a way that made everything else fade out. And I could feel it now, that thin line between curiosity and fear, stretching tighter with every second, because if remembering had broken me before, then there had to be something in those memories that was not just painful, but overwhelming in a way I could not yet comprehend. And I swallowed slowly, my throat dry as I looked down at the note again, at the words written in a hand that felt like mine, but belonged to someone I could not fully reach. And I realized something then, something quiet but undeniable. I had not just been trying to remember, I had been trying to protect myself from remembering too much at once, and that realization shifted something inside me. Not completely, not enough to erase the confusion, but enough to change the way I was looking at all of this. Because for the first time, I was not just asking what happened, I was asking why I needed to forget in the first place. And I exhaled slowly, my grip on the note loosening just slightly as I let that thought settle. Then I did not just forget. I said quietly, more to myself than to him, piecing it together as I spoke. I had to forget. And Lucas did not interrupt, did not correct me. He just watched, his gaze steady in a way that felt almost grounding despite everything else. And that alone told me I was getting closer, closer to something real, something that mattered, and I felt it then. That subtle shift in the way my thoughts were moving, less scattered now, more focused, like I was finally following a thread instead of chasing fragments. And I looked back at him, my voice steadier this time. You said I was starting to forget things, I continued. And then I forgot you. And even saying it felt strange, like the idea of forgetting him did not fully fit with the way I saw him now, with the way something in me still reacted to him without understanding why. And that contradiction alone made my chest tighten, because it meant whatever we had, whatever existed between us before, had been strong enough to leave something behind even after everything else was gone. And I could see it in the way he was looking at me now, not just with patience, not just with restraint, but with something deeper, something that had not faded even after everything that had happened. And I swallowed, my voice dropping slightly as the next question formed, more careful this time, more deliberate. What was I trying to protect? I asked, because that was the only explanation that made sense now, that there had been something worth losing myself over, something that made forgetting feel like the safer option. And Lucas's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but enough that I noticed, enough that I felt it, that quiet hesitation that meant I was getting close to something he had not yet said out loud. And he took a slow breath before answering, his voice lower than before. Not what? He said, and the correction alone made my pulse spike, because that meant I was asking the wrong question. Who? He added, and the words settled heavily between us, because that changed everything, and I felt it immediately, that shift from abstract to personal, from something distant to something right in front of me. And I looked at him, really looked at him, as the realization began to take shape, slow but undeniable, because there was only one person in this room that could fit that answer. And I felt my breath catch as the thought fully formed, sharp and clear. You, I said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, but something in between, something I was still trying to understand. And Lucas did not look away, did not hesitate. He just nodded once, small and certain, and that was enough, because the truth was already there, settled into the space between us, heavy and unavoidable. And I felt it hit me then, not all at once, not like a memory returning, but like a realization breaking through. Because if I had needed to forget him, if remembering him had been enough to break me before, then whatever existed between us had not just been important, it had been overwhelming. And I could feel it now, that faint pull, that quiet recognition that did not come from memory, but from something deeper, something that had not been erased completely. And I took a slow step back, my heart pounding louder now as I tried to process it. Because this was no longer just about who I had been. It was about what we had been, and the thought settled into me with a weight that made it harder to breathe. Because if I had been willing to lose myself to protect him, then whatever I might remember next was not just going to change me. It was going to change the way I saw him, the way I saw us, and for the first time, I was not sure I was ready for that, and I could feel it in the way my thoughts hesitated, the way my instincts pulled in two different directions, one pushing me forward, toward the truth, toward the memories I had lost, and the other holding me back, warning me that there was a reason I had set these limits in the first place. And I stood there, caught between them, as the quiet question formed again. Softer now, but more dangerous than before, not just what happened between us. But what if remembering it changes everything again? The realization did not fade. It settled deeper, rooting itself into something I could no longer ignore, and I could feel it in the way my chest rose and fell slower now, like my body was trying to keep up with a truth my mind had only just begun to accept, because this was not just about memory anymore. It was about choice, about the version of me who had stood in this same room and decided that forgetting was safer than remembering, and that thought alone shifted everything, because it meant I had not just lost something. I had given it up, deliberately, for a reason that still existed even if I could not see it yet. And I looked at Lucas again, really looked at him, not as the person I had met recently, not as the one I thought I knew, but as the one who had been here before, who had seen me before I became this version of myself. And I could feel it now, that faint pull again, stronger than before, like something inside me. Recognized him even if I could not place why, and it made my breath catch slightly as I spoke, quieter now, but more certain. If I needed to forget you, I said slowly, piecing it together as I went, then remembering you must have been the thing that broke me. And Lucas did not answer immediately, but his silence this time was not avoidance, it was confirmation, and I saw it in the way his expression softened just slightly, like he was not surprised that I had reached that conclusion. And that alone made something tighten in my chest, because it meant I was getting closer. Closer to something real, something that mattered, and I could feel it now, that tension building again, not just confusion anymore, but anticipation, because if I was right, then the next step was not just understanding what happened, it was deciding whether I was ready to face it again. And I swallowed, my fingers loosening slightly around the note as I let it fall back onto the desk. The paper settling softly against the wood like it had done this before, like it had been waiting for this exact moment to repeat itself. And I realized then that everything in this room was not just evidence. It was preparation, something I had left behind for myself to find, piece by piece, in the right order, at the right time. And that thought alone made my pulse quicken, because it meant I was not lost, not completely. There was a path here, one I had already laid out, even if I could not see all of it yet. And I took a slow breath, steadying myself as I looked back at Lucas, my voice quieter now, but more focused. You said I told you not to tell me everything. I continued. So that means there is something I need to find on my own. And Lucas nodded once, the movement small but certain, and that was enough, because it confirmed what I was starting to understand, that this was not something he could give me. It was something I had to reach myself, at my own pace, in my own way, and I could feel it now, that shift from confusion to something else, something more deliberate, more controlled. Because for the first time since I stepped into this house, I was not just reacting, I was choosing how to move forward, and I turned slightly, my gaze drifting back across the room, taking in the details again, the desk, the bed, the photos, all of it. But this time it felt different, not overwhelming, not suffocating, but purposeful, like each piece was part of something larger, something I was starting to understand, and my eyes stopped on the mirror again, on that reflection that still looked like me but felt just slightly unfamiliar, and I held its gaze for a moment, longer than before, like I was searching for something beyond what I could see, and for a second, there was something there, not a full memory, not even a clear image, but a feeling, standing in this same spot, looking at this same reflection, making a decision I no longer remembered, and the thought settled into me quietly but firmly. I chose this, and I felt that realization take hold, not as fear this time, not as confusion, but as something steadier, something more grounded, because if I had chosen to forget, then I had also trusted that I would be able to handle remembering again, eventually, and that meant I was not as fragile as I had been made to feel. I was just not there yet, and I exhaled slowly, my shoulders relaxing just slightly as I looked back at Lucas, really seeing him now, not just as the center of the mystery, but as part of the answer, part of whatever I had been trying to protect. And the question that came next was quieter, but more certain than anything I had asked before. Then what did I leave for myself next? I said, because I could feel it now, that there was more, something just beyond this room, just beyond what I had already found, something waiting, exactly where I had intended it to be. And Lucas held my gaze for a moment before answering, his voice low but steady. You said you would know where to look when you were ready. And the words settled into the space between us like a key, simple but significant, and I felt it then, that subtle shift in my thoughts, that quiet alignment, like something clicking into place, because, without thinking, without questioning it, my mind moved in a direction I had not consciously chosen, and I turned toward the door, my steps slow but certain, because even though I could not explain it yet, I knew, with a clarity that felt both new and familiar at the same time, that the next piece of the truth was not here, and whatever I had left behind for myself, whatever answer I was not ready to hear all at once, it was waiting somewhere else. Exactly where I had planned it to be. The certainty did not come from memory. It came from something deeper, something instinctive, like a direction my mind followed without needing to understand why. And I stepped out of the room without looking back, my hand brushing lightly against the doorframe as I passed. The contact brief but grounding, like I needed to feel something real as everything else shifted around me. And the hallway stretched out ahead, quiet and dim, the same soft lighting casting long shadows along the walls. And for a second I hesitated, not because I did not know where to go, but because I did. And that realization settled into my chest with a strange mix of clarity and unease. Because knowing meant this was not new. This was something I had already done before, something I had already chosen, and I could feel it now, that faint pull guiding me forward, steady and certain, and I followed it, my steps slow but deliberate, until I reached the end of the hallway where a narrow set of stairs led down, and I stopped there for just a moment, my hand resting lightly on the railing as I looked down into the darker space below, and something about it felt heavier, quieter, like whatever waited there had been left untouched. For a reason, and I exhaled slowly before stepping down, each step echoing softly in the stillness, the sound almost too loud in the silence. And as I reached the bottom, the air felt cooler, the light dimmer, and I could feel my pulse quicken, not out of fear, but anticipation, because I knew, without questioning it, that this was where I needed to be. And my gaze moved across the space until it landed on a small wooden cabinet against the far wall. Simple, unremarkable, and yet something about it stood out immediately, like it had been waiting for me to notice it, and I walked toward it slowly, my fingers brushing lightly against the surface as I reached it, the wood smooth beneath my touch, worn just enough to suggest it had been used often, and I did not hesitate this time. I opened it, and inside was a single object, nothing else, just one small, black recorder, resting neatly in the center, and my breath caught slightly as I stared at it, because I knew what it was before I even picked it up, not logically, not consciously, but in that same quiet, instinctive way everything else had felt tonight. And my fingers closed around it, lifting it carefully, the weight solid and real in my hand, and there was a small label on the side, handwritten, the same familiar script as the note, and I felt my chest tighten as I read it. Play when you are ready. And for a moment I just stood there, holding it, feeling the weight of what it represented, because this was not just another clue, not just another piece of the puzzle. This was something direct, something intentional, something I had left for myself knowing exactly what it would mean when I found it. And I could feel it now. That tension building again. Not confusion this time, not uncertainty, but something sharper, something more focused, because whatever was on this recorder was not filtered, not controlled, not held back the way Lucas had been. It was the truth, unedited, unprotected, exactly as I had chosen to leave it. And that realization made my grip tighten slightly, because it meant this was the moment where everything could change, where the careful pace I had been following could break all at once. And I swallowed slowly, my thumb brushing over the small play button without pressing it, because for the first time since this began, I had a choice, a real one. I could move forward slowly, piece by piece, or I could listen and let everything come at once, exactly the way I had warned myself not to. And I stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in around me, the weight of the recorder steady in my hand, and I could feel it, that pull in two directions again, one urging me to press it, to finally understand everything, and the other holding me back, reminding me that there had been a reason I set limits, a reason I chose to forget. And I closed my eyes briefly, taking a slow breath as I tried to steady myself, because this was not just about finding answers anymore. It was about deciding how much I was ready to face. And when I opened my eyes again, my gaze lifted slightly, not to the room, not to the cabinet, but to the faint reflection in the dark surface of the recorder, my own face staring back at me, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. And I could feel it then, that quiet certainty settling into place, because whatever happened next, whatever I heard when I finally pressed that button, it was something I had chosen to leave behind, something I had trusted myself to handle when the time was right. And the only question left was whether that time was now. And my thumb hovered just above the button, steady but unmoving, as the thought surfaced one last time. clear, and undeniable. If I press this, I will not just remember who I was. I will understand why I had to become someone else. And I was not sure yet if I was ready to lose that version of myself again.